Right, so you know what? We'll start in English, and if anyone comes that speaks Hebrew, we'll switch to Hebrew. Okay, so we're on page 123, and we're dealing with the laws of Chazara. And for the meantime, we skipped a whole bunch of pages here that deal with various kinds of various kinds of gas heaters and the Kir gas. He has a whole section here. So, Plata Chashmalit, all this kind of stuff. It'll come up sort of today as well, but not head on, if you know what I mean. Okay. So there are two basic approaches to the Isser Chazara to replace something on the fire on Shabbos. And based on these two explanations, we're going to see what are the conditions under which Chazal will allow you to do Chazara. So if you take a look at number one, you'll see that he starts with the Rashba. And this is a Sugya Masechta Shabbos and Daf Mem. The Rashba points out that we're dealing with an Isur called Nire Kimavashel. In the Gemara's language, it's called Mechse Kimavashel. And therefore, if you're going to put something on the fire in Shabbos, what does it look like to the spectator? Mamish looks like he's being Mavashel. So we're going to have to solve that problem by making sure that, let's say, it doesn't look like Bishul because it looks like he's just like replacing something that was there on Erev Shabbos. Okay. And then he writes the Hafilu Tavshil Shenispashal called Tzorka. Meaning, again, in the eyes of the spectator, he might not know how cooked or uncooked is the Tavshil in the Kedera that you're putting back onto the fire.
Who's watching you in your house? Like Erev Shabbos?
Right. That's an excellent question. Yeah, what is Mechse Kimavashel? Is it really an issue of the spectator? I have a feeling that the spectator is just a gauge for how much this seems like Bishul, and you yourself will begin to confuse it with Bishul. And you're going to say, well, if this is Mutter, maybe this is Mutter, you start extending it. But how do we know that in the eyes of a person, he might come to do Bishul because he thinks this is Bishul? For that, we're going to look into the eyes of the spectator. So it's really the eyes of the spectator is what we call a simon, not a siba. You know what I mean? And it's not that's not the reason why it's awesome. The reason why it's awesome is because you might think it's bishul, but we're going to use as a gauge, I call it a simon l'davar, the fact that the spectator sees something that looks exactly like bishul.
And then you'll think. You'll get used to it.
You'll get used to it, and before you know it, so we have to make some sort of distinction here with certain conditions so that when you put it back on the fire, it's obviously that, this is not bishul. For example, if you have a grufa and a ketuma, so you've taken out all the coals, or in our case, you cover the fire. In that case, it doesn't look like bishul because you yourself realize that you've made these changes. So that's number one is the Rashba, and that's called Mechse Kimavash. So now we get to number two, and that's Rabbeinu Tam, and that's called Shemi Yachata. We've already seen this with regard to Shehi on Erev Shabbos, because if you leave something on the fire on Erev Shabbos and it's cooking over Shabbos, you might come to want to raise the flame, by poking it with a stick or a steel, whatever it is, and that would be that would consider it mavashal. And once again, we're going to try to see if we can set up a chazara in a way that person wouldn't come to do chitur. For that, we might need misbashal kol tzarko, maybe even mistamik viralo, or we might need a gruf and a ketuma, and therefore, there's no fire to poke, there's no coals. And that brings us to section number two, which is called Tanaya Chazara. In other words, at what point are we going to permit Chazara? Now, let me just make one side point here. This is all Beis Hillel. Beit Shammai says that Chazara is completely awesome. But we pass like Beis Hillel, and therefore it's a valid question to raise: under what conditions did Beis Hillel allow Chazara? But we're going to take both explanations for the Isser Chazara, and we're going to try to find conditions which will address both Mechse Kimavasha L'Rashba and Shemi Yechata B'Gecholim, the Rabbeinu Tam. So when you see the first Tanai, which we're going to now study in the Gemara in Shabbos Lamed Vav, is what we call a Grufa and a Ketuma. That's going to be Tanai number one. So we're not even talking about the Ochel itself, that we'll get to, but first and foremost, what does this oven look like? Is it in a situation where it looks like you're putting something to cook in the oven, or you might come to do chitui? So the Mishnah says the following: Kira shehi sikua b'kash ub'gvava nosnim oleh tavshil. Now, kash and gvava are kinds of straw that just go up in flames immediately. They don't create any sort of coals. But gefes ubi eitzim, so these are kind of solid materials that with the flame, they become coals, they become gechol. Lo yiten ad sheyigrof or ad sheyiten sa'efer. So you have two options here. Either you goref, which means you sweep out all the gecholim, so there's nothing in the kira, right? The kira is we'll see the structure of the kira, but anyway, the coals are always on the panim. But if you remove the coals, then the tafshil is not on top of the coals. And that's called grufa. Then there's something called a ktuma. Ktuma means you cover it. How do you cover it? So in the Mishnah, you cover it by sprinkling afer on top. Now, when you sprinkle afer on top, what happens is you are speeding up the process of extinguishing the fire. So we're no longer thinking that he's going to want to raise the level of the fire, right? Increase the fire, because he did just the opposite. You know, he did afer, which he'd be shooting himself in the foot if he really wants to get a fire. But Beit Shammai say that, okay, you know, you're allowed to set this up on Erev Shabbos, such that on Shabbos Notlim, you take it off, but ein machzirin, you're not allowed to put it back on. So according to Beit Shammai, even if you have all the conditions met, no chazar is allowed. And that's why Beit Shammai add the words v'hulo machzirin. But Beis Hillel omrim af machzirin, meaning just like we said that you're allowed to leave the tavshil on the fire if it's a grora for a katum, so that permits shehi on Erev Shabbos. For the same reason, we're going to say that you could do chazar. But as we're going to go along, we're going to see that grufa ktuma is only one condition. Grufa ktuma is enough to be matir shehi on Erev Shabbos. But for chazar on Shabbos, even according to Beis Hillel, we're going to need more than just gar for katum, and that we're going to see on page 124. But he wants to point out here on the side, going back to the different types of stoves and ovens that they had, that our stove, according to Ravad Yosef, is equal to a gara for katum. Because Lamaisa, when you look at our stove and you open the door of the oven, you won't see any fire over there. The fire is all the way underneath. It's like hidden away. So logically, Ravad Yosef is correct. We'll soon see the poskim didn't go down this way. I don't know why, but they were very hesitant. Maybe because the oven is designated, exclusively for cooking and baking. But in any event, Ravad Yosef says, right, now you have a problem with the dial.
It's getting cold.
Right, so maybe you have to cover the dial and paste it down or something. But if you take a look about our electric stoves, our ovens, our Ravad Yosef says that our ovens have the status of a gar for katum. And therefore, if we can fulfill the other conditions that we're about to add, then we already fulfilled the first condition. The first condition was gar for katum, and Ravad Yosef says our ovens have the status of a gar for katum. However, even Rav Ovadia Yosef has a limitation to this kula, and he points out that gam lahachmir nochal lahachmir shelo lahachzir Shabbos toch taruch hashvi adolik ve'ev Shabbos. So in other words, even though you have a dry food that's already been cooked, totally cooked, nevertheless it looks like mavashel, and therefore it's not enough to make it into a garuf kotum, because garuf kotum, as we said before, is only the first condition. We need other conditions in order to avoid what's called mechzik mavashel. We've already covered our bases as far as chitui. There's no chash chitui that we mentioned the name of Rabbeinu Tam because the garuf kotum. And in the case of the stove, what are you going to start poking? So that's what Ovadia will say. But because of the additional problem in Chazara of Michsi Kimavashel, which was the Rashba's business, therefore we're going to need other conditions other than Garuf Kotum, because Garuf Kotum will only address the issue of Chitu. Now, even though Rav Ovadia paskins that our ovens have the status of Garuf Kotum, it's like a plata, nevertheless, the Chachmei Ashkenaz, and not only that, even the poskim of Sfarad, the Sephardic poskim that usually follow Rav Ovadia, they hold that our tanur should not be considered like a garuf kotum. And therefore, we don't allow chazara in any case into a tanur, even if we have a fulfillment of all the other conditions that we're about to delineate, because the first basic condition of garuf kotum is, because again, what do you do with the tanur? You put things in, there's heat in the oven, and they cook. So therefore, it's not a garuf kotum, right? The whole purpose of the garuf kotum is to arrest or sort of freeze the process of cooking. But in a tanur, where the heat is trapped inside the oven, then even though there's no poking over here, but nevertheless, it does look like bishul. Now, take a look, for example, at the Shmirat Shabbat Kehilchata. Keder sheyesh ba tavshil v'hi husra me'gabi yesh b'Shabbos motzia min atar b'Shabbos ein lachzira el tov tanur gaz o chashmal. He's saying even if you would make sure that you're not setting up and causing a process of bishul by opening the door of the oven and the cold air comes in, so it means you neutralize the thermostat, but nevertheless, since it's not considered garuf kotum, we're lacking the very first condition that's necessary in order to allow chazara. Ve'ilu b'dvar chazras keder al gabi ha'esh, then we're going to get into the details about chazara al gabi ha'esh. Okay, now we have Rav Moshe Feinstein, who seems to accept Rav Ovadia Yosef. He says, Kufsa shel daled defanos b'toch tanur. You've got an oven, just put in a box that blocks the walls of the oven, and it's considered like a blech. Is therefore blech b'kufsa she'osi midaled defanos mistaber shemuta gam lahachsa. So that's the first condition of garuf kotum. By the way, I want to tell you that I never really saw this with my eyes except for Pesach. I know in some of the members of my family, it's quite common that they put in a box inside the oven for a different reason. It has nothing to do with Shabbos, but it has to do with belia of chametz. But this business on Shabbos, that you put things into the oven because you put a box in the oven and that makes it into a blech, I never saw it. But lower, any raya, just the fact that I didn't see it doesn't prove anything. Okay, now we go on to the second condition. Let's say we've already put a plata up and we have a covered fire, which means a garuf or a kotum. And certainly there's no isur bishul here if it's a garuf or kotum. But we need Michael Mevushal called Sarko. Why do we need Michael Mevushal called Sarko? And the answer is because if there's still heat in the tanur chashmali or in the gas, kirat gas, or let's call it, the plata, it's all hot. Now, to put food on heat is a meleches bishul. So therefore, we have to make sure before we put anything on the fire that it's got to be mavushal kol tzarka. So now we have two conditions. Number one, we've already made it into a grufa and a ketuma, but it's still boiling hot. And if you put it on top of the grufa ketuma, you'd be violating meleches bishul. Therefore, we need the second condition that's already mavushal kol tzarka, and then we activate the principle of ein bishul achar bishul. He adds here that in a case of a suffix, you're not sure whether that's mavushal kol tzarka. You remember that last week we said it's very hard to figure out exactly what mavushal kol tzarka is, what's Michael ben Josiah and all that. So then we have to be machmir. You can't put it back on the oven. It might be that you have a mavushal, but ain't a mavushal, meaning it's only partially mavushal.
But he's not addressing the Lechavitim of Russia. Or the Rabbi, and technically an oven today is going for Chatum, but we don't do it because of Lechavitim of Russia.
Right. That's what it seems to be here. That's what it seems to be here in the Shmir Shabbos Kehilchasa, and many other poskim seem to, they seem to be very, how should I say, hesitant and inhibited about using this heter and considering our tanur a gar for kot.
Yeah, but it's not even a heter anymore. Well, why do you think we can't do it?
No, Rav Vadia says you can't do it.
Because of Lechavitim.
Right. But he says that if it's not mechzik mavashel, for example, if it's already mavushal called sarko, and then we're gonna see about another condition that he's holding on to it and so forth. So it's like he's continuing the original shehiyah. Again, I don't want to jump the gun yet, but then Rav Vadia would say you have a gar for kotum. You could check off that condition, and we go on to see if it's mavushal called sarko, and if it's still in your hand, and you're just putting it back into the oven, according to Rav Vadia. So that's where we get to the Bir Halacha number 7. Im notal b'Shabbos hakder ben akiri, you took it off, and you have a suffix, and you don't know if it's nispashal kol tzarka, you're not allowed to put it back on, even if all the other conditions are met. For example, oda b'yada, which we'll see in a minute, or it's a gar for katum. As long as there's heat in the oven and you're not sure whether it's mavush kol tzarka, don't even dream about putting it back into the oven or onto the blech. Some people think that a blech is like an absolute heter. That's not so. A blech is only going to be matir shehiyah and chazara because it's mavushal kol tzarka. You can't take something that's not mavushal kol tzarka and put it on a plata. And that would be you see, we're playing with fire here, pardon the pun, but I mean, you're getting very close to meleches bishul. And in order to avoid and circumvent any problem with bishul, you got to know this mavushal kol tzarka. So that's number one. Then he has here on the bottom Tanai Shlishi, and the Gemara says that our kira has a top and a bottom to it, right? It was sort of like vertical almost. The fire came all the way in the bottom. That's where they had the coals in a little box or whatever they kept it in. And then the food was on top of like a burner, so to speak. That's where they put the kedera. Okay, so now, where are you going to put your food? Let's assume it's already mavushal kol tzarka. We don't want you to put it lamata, which is close to where the heat is. We want to only put it lamala. But that's as far as the Gemara is concerned. I don't think that this is relevant to us because he says here on page 125, Kira Asuya Ke'en Kedera, right? So it's like deep. Is Nosen Kedera, Toshma di Omar Rabbi Chelbo Gemara in Shabbos Lamed Zayin Omar of Chama Bar Guria Omar Rav Lo Shanu Ela Al Gava Avol Litocha Osa. Whoa.
He's talking about when all the conditions are met. But even then, we don't know that.
Right. Here's where the Shevet Levi in number 11, he's going to describe the difference between our ovens and their kira. Dafka kiros shebishas shehem ke'ein tanur. In other words, their kira was similar to our tanur. Shahaya nase b'kedera k'kedera milamala lamata. So there's a top part and a bottom part. Hagcholim and the cholim is all lamata. Masha enkein chelik shal malo shu rochok min ha'esh. So you have a lot of airspace between the fire and the kedera. V'sholit be'avira v'kevet sheyochel liten lemala v'unosen lemata nira kimachavin levasha. And once again, like you said before, I don't know exactly what the onlooker is saying, but for you it looks like bishul. So all this says the Shevet HaLevi relates to the kira of the time of the Gemara. Masha enkin shalanu, I guess he means our ovens, heim pshutos. Right, there's no like top and a bottom. Lo lamalav lamato, val korchach lo mitztaber koach ha'esh b'mokum echad. So the fire spreads out and basically heats up directly the tavshil in the kedera without any, what he called hefsek avira, sholit be'avira.
I mean, now we also have the top and bottom heat mechanism, right?
They have new ovens now, you mean?
No, not new, not new. I mean, everyone's ovens. The heat isn't only from the bottom; it's from the side, it's from the top. I think like all four walls, I think, can get hot.
Right. Right. That is
true.
But I would think that that's more of a reason to be machmir here. But here, look what he's saying.
Here he's saying that in the time of the Gemara, the heat was concentrated in one place. But today it's not. Today it can be everywhere.
Right, but but wouldn't that be a reason to be machmir in our time because it's coming on all sides? He seems to say, let's read it inside, that it's a kula. He says, "Gam ein lo gav v'toch ki akol toch," and shava b'chom, like you said before. V'chol payim nevash rak b'mokom hazeh kai gav lo gozru al toch. I don't figure that out. What do you mean lo gozru al toch? I mean, we said that toch is also, it's only lamala that it's mutter, but that's only at the time of the shas. But ours, the fire spreads out, so there's no lamala lamata, and therefore we consider everything as what? As toch?
Yeah.
Is that lakula or lachumra?
Because he finishes off the incanata for the group.
Right, so it sounds like he's being makil over here, no? Gam ein lo gav. Called palm vashal rak b'mokom hazeh. Kahai gav no lo gozru. That seems to be very explicit that he's making. All right, this has to be understood better. Let's go on. Tanai Revi'i, Dafka ima kedera adayin biyodo. Now, I don't know, is that enough? Because then he writes v'daito lahachsi. So I don't know what the vav of v'daito means. And that's what he says here on the bottom, that there's going to be a machlokes in the Gemara, is if, let's say, you have one of those two conditions, it's either biyado or it's daito lahatsa, even if it's not biyado. And then afkamin is going to be, are you allowed to do chazara where he puts it down on the karka? So it's not biyado, but on the other hand, he had das to put it back on. Or, for example, im tzarech das adam tia lahachzir sakadera kvar mishashanotla. Let's say, for example, he didn't have das immediately that he's going to put it back, but it's still in his hand. So do I need both A plus B or either A or B? So again, two nafkaminas. Let's go to two questions. Question number one is going to be in a case where he puts it on the ground, but it was das was lahachzir. Question nafkamina number two is going to be where he's holding it in his hand, but he didn't have das lahachzir. And then all of a sudden he decided, I want to put it back on.
I don't
I'm pretty sure we're going to possibly need both. What?
I get a situation because usually if you would pull something out of the oven and hold it in your hands and your dot is to put it back, right? Then it means that you're probably just checking if it's cooked. But here we're talking about it has to be Rushal called circle anyway. So why would he check?
Well, again, even if it's a Rushal called circle, he wants to keep it warm. Right? Let's say he's got people eating at 10, and then he has another group of people eating at 11. So he wants to keep it warm. He wants to put it back onto the blech. So it's a group and a ketuma, but once he takes it off, we automatically activate the nirakim of vashel svar. Because, it's still hot. So what do we say? Well, no, he's not doing a chazara, he's just replacing the original shehir. That's the logic. Now, what does it take to achieve that goal of replacing the original shehir? Is it daito lahachzir, or it's got to be biyodo? So one approach is either one is good. Even if he didn't have daito lahachzir, but it's still in his hand, when he decides to put it back on, he's just replacing the original shia. The other one is to say that once he put it, is that even if he put it on the ground, that's fine, because it was daito lahachzir. Okay. So that's what he says on the bottom here. Let's go over it one more time. 125 on the bottom. The Gemara muveis machlokes in mutal hachsel akira kasher iniach es hakarka es hakdera lakarka, even though it's daito lahachzir. V'chein, and so too in tzarech das ha'odam tchil lahachzir kedera, even if it's still biyado, that's not enough, and you need daito lahachzir. So now he goes through a whole Gemara here on page 126. Let's see how much of this Gemara we can figure out. Beis Hillel Omrim Af Machzir Omer Av Sheshes L'Divrei Omer, according to Beis Hillel Machzir Afilu b'Shabbos, and Rav Oshia says the same thing. So again, the purpose and the goal of Beis Hillel is to be matir chazara on Shabbos. Honestly, I don't know what the chiddush is. What's the alternative? I mean, put it back on chol. I don't get it. Anyway, Omer Rab speak lo shanu el sha'odam biyad aval inichal gabi karka osur. So it sounds like odam biyado is an absolute condition. If shalvater aleh, but the only thing is, Rab Zrika Omer Rav Am doesn't mention a word about daito lahachzir. Omer Rav Ami. Rabbi Tadoi di Avad legarme hu di Ovid elahachi kamer Rav Chia Omer Rav Yochanan afilu inichal gabi karka muter. Okay, so inichal gabi karka is muter, and now we have to skip over to Chizkiah. Chizkiah says bishmeida baye hadi amrit odom biyado muter. That which we said in the name of Rabbi Eliezer, that Odom Yadav is mutter. Lo amru el shedaito lahachzir. Aval ein daito lahachzir also. Michlal vel gabi karka af pishu daito lahachzir also. So the Gemara wants to indike from Chizkiah, you need two conditions. You need daito lahachzir and you need biyodo, that it's not al gabi karka. However, Ika di amri Chizkiah mishmei dvar hodi amor al gabi karka also. לא אומר לו שאין דייטה להחסה, דייטה להחסה מותר מכלל שבעוד ביודו אף על פי שאין דייטה להחסה מותר. So then it's an either or situation, and any one of those two conditions is sufficient. And therefore, the Sikum, he says, Lishna Kam, according to the first Lishna, you need both conditions. It's got to be Oda V'Yoda Daita Lahas. According to the second Lishna, all you need is one, either Oda V'Yoda, even if it's not Daita Lahas, or Daita Lahas, even if it's not, even if he puts it down on the kark. Nechliku Rishon L'fi Eza V'Gemara Lifsak Halacha, Rif, Rosh, Poskim L'Chumra Kedei Rishona, Tzarch Shei Oda V'Yoda V'Daita Lahas. And now we'll just skip to the Rambam for a second on the next page. L'umasam harambam heikil v'tola kol miniach hakarka lo. Wow. So the Rambam says, forget about daita lahas. Did he put it on the karka or did he not put it on the karka? Says the Beis Yosef, the Rambam doesn't seem to make any sense. It's not like the Lishna Kama, nor like the Lishna Basra. Right? The question is whether one of two conditions or both conditions. The Rambam only has one condition of Lo iniach al gabi karka. Kosher. This is the Beis Yosef in 16. Shelo chilek bein daita lahachs li ein daita lahachs. Bein in posek lishna kama, bein in posek lishna basra. The efshe shu sover the kevet hamoroi kamoy lo chilku bein daita lahachs li ein daita lahachs here. So the first set of hamoroim, which are called the kamoy, they didn't introduce this condition, this issue of badait lachsa. All they said is it on gabi karka, is it still biyodo? Therefore, lo chayshinon lechizkiya v'shmei dabaye the maflig beinayim. So we don't have to be choshesh according to the Rambam for that shita that requires daito lahachsa, because that's amoroi basroi. That's not the original amoroi kamod. Okay, now we have the famous question of what is karka in this context. Let's say you put it on the shayish, or you put it on, the Gemara has you put it on a mita. Well, let's say you put it on a table. That would be a classic example. So it's not al gabi karka, but it's not biyodo. Do we need that it has to be biyodo, or it's sufficient if it's not al gabi karka? So that you'll see in number 16. A Gemara histapka ma dinim lo inicha agabi karka el al mokom acher kigon mita. Boy Rabbi Yirmiyah tlon b'makel mahu hinicha al gabi mita mahu teku. So I assume that teku is going to be la'alocha l'chumra, even though we're dealing with a suffix d'rabbanan. But let's see. Nechleku rishon b'din Rambam l'shitosa hekel kevich is isu d'rabbanan. Okay. Harif haroshech miru mitam shekosav haran li'el. The Ran says that since bishul is very complicated, we want to avoid it at all costs. So we're always going to be machmir. The Ramah and the Shulchan Aruch are going to have machlokes la'alocha. The Shulchan Aruch passes like the Ram l'kula, and the Ramah passes like the Rif and the Rosh l'chumra. I wonder why the Shulchan Aruch paskins l'kula against the Rif and the Rosh. That's unusual. Klomer l'das Shulchan Aruch ein tzorach b'tnai shel oda biyodo v'daita lahachzir la'ikir shelo yinich al gabi karka.
It's a big kula.
Wow, yeah.
Because then we have none of the conditions.
Das Ramah yesh lo sifus hatnoim shel oda biyodo v'daita lahachzir, and you need both. What about the later poskim? Does he bring the later poskim? Yeah, I think he's going to bring the later poskim here on page 128. But I think we'll stop here. And I don't know what to do next week if, let's say, Yehuda comes, or whether we should start from scratch. I don't know. You'll tell me. I don't want to bore you.